Welcome to Storyline. I'm Pastor Nathan Renner from Madison Campus in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm so happy that you've joined us for our final sermon in the series Eden to Eden, where we have explored God's story, the story that begins in Genesis, the story of God creating this earth to be the connecting point for heaven. He created humanity to dwell in His presence, to reflect His image, to enjoy His relational love, to reflect that relational love out. We learned in our previous messages that humanity fell and stepped away from their calling to enjoy the presence of God. Humanity plunged into alienation and moved east away from God's presence. But God maintained His commitment to humanity, and He promised that someday a descendant of Eve would come and would solve humanity's problems. And it traces that story through the lineage of Eve, through Seth, through Noah, through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob, through the people of Israel, through Mount Sinai, all the way down to the coming of the Messiah. So here we are today on our final message titled, New Jerusalem, More Than an Eden Restored. More Than an Eden Restored. Today, we are going to study 4 stories in the book of Mark that describe the way that the presence of God, they describe the way the goodness of God, they describe the way the gospel of God was to expand to more and more and more people. So we're going to pick the story up in the book of Mark chapter 6, and the story, geography plays an incredibly important role in this story. The first story starts on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. It's a familiar story. It's the feeding of the 5,000. It's been a rough season. The disciples have been out on their first missionary tour. John the Baptist had been killed. The team was tired and grieving, and it was time for them to go have some rest. Mark chapter 6, verse 32. And they went away in a boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When they went ashore, he saw a great crowd. I just, picture, you're tired, you're worn out, and you want some rest as a leader, and the people see where you're going, and they run ahead, get there before you, and here you show up at this place where you're hoping to get some rest, and instead of rest, there is a massive crowd gathered. Jesus had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and He began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, His disciples came to Him and said, "This is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But He answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to Him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And He said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then He commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and fifties, and taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, He looked up into heaven and said a blessing, and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And He divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were, that next word is important, satisfied. Remember that word. Jesus feeds the 5,000, and they all eat, and they are all satisfied, and they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces of fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. Now, I want you to follow this story. It's a simple story. There's a crowd of people. They're hungry. Jesus feeds them. They are completely satisfied, and probably the important punchline of the story is that there are 12 baskets full of broken bread and fish. And the punchline there of the 12 baskets is, with Jesus, there is enough. Jesus provides enough to nourish the 12 baskets represent the 12 tribes of Israel. With Jesus, there is enough spiritual and physical nourishment to nourish all of the people of Israel. That's the punchline of this story. Now, Jesus is going to leave. Jesus is on his way from this western side of the Sea of Galilee, and they are now, it says, according to Mark chapter 6, verse 45, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Jesus is on his way from this Jewish region where he's at, where he feeds the 5,000, where it satisfies the 5,000, where there are now 12 baskets left over, one basket for each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus is now making the journey away from this really strongly Gentile Jewish territory, and he's going to Bethsaida. Bethsaida means house of hunting and fishing. When I think of Bethsaida, I think of someplace like northern Idaho, where people go to get away from anything like the control of the Roman Empire, the government. They're going to northern Idaho because there's nothing there except for hunting and fishing. And so the disciples are wanting to go to this wild place away from the city, a place where people escape the dangers of city life. This is the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. This town is also on the border between the Jewish land of Israel and the Gentile lands surrounding Israel. This geographical marker signals that Jesus is going beyond the racial and social and religious boundaries of Israel. This geographical marker signals that the gospel is moving to expand beyond the borders of Israel. This geographic indicator indicates that the gospel is about to become a lot more inclusive. Now, in order to get there, Jesus walks on water, like he's leading a new exodus, like he's the God of the Old Testament who has control over the sea. But before they get to Bethsaida, the land of the Gentiles, they need to stop at Gennesaret, Mark chapter 6, verse 53. When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and moored to the shore. Before they can go to this land that is very close to the Gentile territory, they need to stop along the way and have an important conversation. Now, we're looking at 4 stories of bread. So the first story of bread is the feeding of the 5,000 and the 12 baskets left over. The second story of bread, it's Mark chapter 7, verse 1. Mark 7, verse 1. We'll pick it up on the screen. Now, when the disciples gathered to him with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly. Now, here in Mark chapter 7, we are not talking about people who understand germ theory, who are washing their hands in order to protect themselves from disease. We are talking about a ritual that was designed to protect Jews from spiritual defilement. And this is how it worked. If I go shopping and I am shopping, there may be some dirty Gentile people there, and I may touch them, or I might touch something that those dirty Gentiles touched, and I may be contaminated by that, not like I'm going to catch a disease, but like I am going to receive some spiritual defilement from those people. So, if I came home and tucked into a plate of noodles, or tucked into some hummus and tabbouleh and some bread, after having possibly been around some nasty, dirty Gentiles, I'm not speaking in my own voice, I'm speaking in the voice of the legalistic religious people of Jesus' day. If I've been around these nasty, dirty Gentiles, now I'm going to go eat some food. Well, I've touched them, I've touched something they touched. Now I'm going to ingest their spiritual defilement. So, in order to protect myself from ingesting their spiritual defilement, I am going to wash my hands. This is not a scrub-a-dub-dub kind of wash. This is a ritual washing designed to protect me from the spiritual defilement of the ungodly or the irreligious or the non-Jewish people I may encounter. And so the Pharisees come to Jesus and they're like, hey, Jesus, your boys, they don't wash their hands properly. Now notice Jesus' response. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly, holding to the traditions of the elders, and when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash, and there are many other traditions that they observe, such as washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? And he said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandments of God and hold to the traditions of men. Full stop here. Jesus is awesome, right? Isn't Jesus awesome? He is asked this question, why don't they do this? And Jesus does not play nice. He blasts them as hypocrites, and he then says, and I'm skipping a couple verses here just for the sake of time, verse 14, he called the people to him again and said, hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable, and he said to them, are you also without understanding? Don't you see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean. Now, we need to take a moment and understand what is going on here. What is going on here is Jesus has been firmly in Jewish territory, and he has nourished the Jews physically and spiritually, and he has provided enough leftover bread that the whole Jewish nation can be nourished off what Jesus has done. Now, Jesus is moving from that Jewish territory toward Gentile territory, but before they can go to Gentile territory, they need to stop off and have a conversation. And the conversation that they have is this. The conversation is that you cannot catch spiritual cooties from spiritually dirty people. That spiritual defilement is determined by the content of your character, not by catching something from someone else. So Jesus has this conversation with the Pharisees. They think that you can get spiritually defiled, you can just catch it like it's a disease. And Jesus says, this is not the case. You don't catch spiritual defilement. Spiritual defilement comes from within. Now, we just need to pause here because on the screen it says, thus he declared all foods clean. And many people get from this text, they read this text, and they assume that this means that the distinction the Old Testament makes between clean and unclean food has been done away with. And this is totally unlikely for two reasons. First of all, Jesus is not having a conversation about the kind of food to eat. He's having a conversation about whether or not food can defile you if you don't wash your hands. Now, I'm going to put three quotations up from evangelical scholars. The first is from the Evangelical Quarterly, and it says, it is unlikely that Jesus made this pronouncement on the inviolability of the Torah, rebuked others for neglecting God's commandments, and then immediately after declared prominent parts of the Torah abolished. Okay? That's quote number one. Quote number two, Mark 7:19 does not mean an abrogation of the regulations of the Torah concerning clean and unclean foods. i.e. Leviticus 11, Deuteronomy 14, clean and unclean animals. But that Jesus denies rabbinic purity halacha. Now, this again, another quotation. Third one, Jesus has no intention of denying that the purity laws occupy a significant place in the Mosaic Code, or of detracting from the dignity of men who suffered death rather than to violate the law of God governing unclean foods. The big idea here is really simple. I can't say nobody, but most serious scholars do not think here that Jesus is doing away with clean and unclean foods as a moral law from the Old Testament. What they think is going on is that there were these Jewish traditions around food that were added to God's law, and that these Jewish traditions were causing Jews to imagine that they could catch some spiritual cooties, and Jesus makes it clear. In fact, Jesus says it this way, what comes out of a person is what defiles him, for from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within, and they defile a person. Here in Mark 7, Jesus is making it absolutely clear. Our defilement does not come from without. I cannot be defiled by you. I defile myself by the content of my heart. So Jesus was in Jewish territory. Jesus is moving toward Gentile territory. But in order to go to Gentile territory and expand the presence of God to the Gentiles, he has to have a conversation with his disciples. And that conversation is this: don't go to the Gentile territory and think they're going to give you something. You're going to catch something. No. Remember, it is what comes out of you that defiles you. All right, that's the first conversation. The second conversation is found in Mark chapter 7. Jesus goes immediately after that. From there, he arose and went to the region of Tyre and Sidon. This is full Gentile territory. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now, the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth. And she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way, and the demon has left your daughter." And she went home, found the child lying in bed, and the demon gone. Now, this story is quite the radical story, right? This story is quite the radical story. I don't know about you, but I would guess there are very few women who appreciate being called a dog. Calling a woman dog is never a compliment. And it wasn't a compliment, it isn't a compliment today, and it certainly wasn't a compliment in the days of Jesus. So when Jesus says, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs," and then that is not a compliment. And in some sense, that is not nice. In fact, it sounds almost racist. So here's the question. Was Jesus being racist? I mean, that's one possibility, right? And there are many scholars who think, yes, Jesus was a Jew, and as a Jew, he thought of Gentiles as dogs, and he just said what a Jewish person would say. That's one option. The other option is that Jesus was just being an ignorant buffoon, right? That's the other option, right? Well, he wasn't being mean and racist, he was just being ignorant. That's another option. But I don't think that's a very good option either. The third option is that Jesus was somewhat like a modern comedian. A modern comedian sometimes enacts a racist worldview in order to critique it. And I believe Jesus was stepping into the voice of the disciples. Jesus was stepping into the racist attitudes of the disciples in order to blow them up. In fact, when she responds, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs, and Jesus then says to her, for this statement you go your way, the demon has left your daughter, and she went home and found the child lying in the bed and the demon gone. It's amazing. Jesus heals this woman's child, and the demon is gone. And maybe the best way to say it, and this is so incredible, when Jesus says to her, as it says on the slide, he said to her, let the children be fed first. That little phrase there, it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And he answered her, yes, Lord, even the dogs under the children's table eat the children's crumbs. It's interesting because in this text right here, chapter 7, that word satisfied shows up again. That word satisfied shows up again. And she is claiming the right. I know you don't see it. It's in the Greek. It's there though. It's in the Greek. That same Greek word shows up, and she is saying that she has the same right to be satisfied as the Jews did. She's recognizing her access, right? She's recognizing her access to Jesus. She's recognizing that Jesus provides not only bread for the Jews, but she recognizes in Jesus the truth that you don't catch defilement from somebody else. Defilement comes from within. She recognizes that Jesus is providing satisfaction not just for Jews, but for all people. She's recognizing Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise of Abraham to bless all people. And so Jesus says, let the children be satisfied, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. And she says, yes, but even the dogs get the crumbs. And Jesus is like, you get it. You get it. You get that God is not a racist. You get that the gospel is for everyone. Now, we go on to our last story. The last story, Mark chapter 8. Jesus has now traveled into full Gentile territory. Remember, Jesus started in Jewish territory. In Jewish territory, Jesus feeds the 5,000, and there are 12 baskets of bread left over. That's bread enough for all the tribes. And then they're moving toward the Gentile territory, but before they get there, they have to have two important conversations. Conversation number one is that your defilement isn't caught by touching dirty people or dirty things. Defilement comes from inside. That's conversation number one. Conversation number two is that there's a Gentile dog who has better faith than many Jews. And she has the right to be satisfied with crumbs from Jesus' table. Just like, by the way, the Jews had 12 crumbs, 12 baskets of crumbs, and what she's saying is there ought to be baskets of crumbs for me too. And Jesus, after he has this first conversation that defilement comes from the heart, you can't catch it from somebody else, and this second conversation that there ought to be crumbs enough for the Gentiles, after that, Jesus has trained his disciples, and they are ready to go into the Gentile territory. Here in Mark 9, they're in full Gentile territory. In those days, when again a great crowd had gathered, they had nothing to eat. And he called his disciples to him and said to them, I have compassion on the crowd, because they've been with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And if I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way. And some of them have come far away. And his disciples answered him, how can we feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? And he asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. And he directed the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples and set before the people. And they set them down before the crowd, and they had a few small fish, and having blessed them, he said that these also should be set before them. And they ate, and there's that word. And they ate and were satisfied. And they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full, and there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. Now, you've got to see this, my brothers and sisters, my friends. You've got to see this. There are 7 baskets full. Now, forever, I struggled. I was frustrated. I could not understand why in the feeding of the 5,000 there were 12 baskets, and in the feeding of the 4,000 there are only 7 baskets. Why is there this difference? And the answer is incredible. In Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 19, see in this sermon, it is describing the Old Testament conquest of the Canaan land. And notice what it says, Acts chapter 13, verse 19. Acts 13, 19. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. Israel destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, and that land was given to Israel as their inheritance. And you can see the same thing in Deuteronomy 7. In Deuteronomy 7, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you. And now let's count them. Number 1, the Hittites. Number 2, the Girgashites. Number 3, the Amorites. Number 4, the Canaanites. Number 5, the Perizzites. Number 6, the Hivites. And number 7, the Jebusites. And then it says, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. You got to see this. When God drove the nations out of the Canaan land, there were 7 nations driven out of there. Now here, Jesus feeds the 5,000 in Jewish land, and there are 12 baskets left over, 1 basket of bread, crumbs for all the Jews to feast on. Jesus crumbs for all the Jews. And now they're on their way to Gentile land, but they can't get to the Gentile land before they have 2 important conversations. Important conversation number 1 is that it is the content of your heart, not who you touch, that determines the kind of person you are. That is exactly the message the Jews needed to hear when Jesus was moving toward Gentile land. Maybe there are Gentiles like the Syrophoenician woman who have more faith in their heart and trust in God more than Jews, some Jews who have turned their back on God. So now, Jesus has had the conversations that he needed to have. Jesus is now full in Gentile territory. He feeds the 4,000, and there are 7 baskets. 7 baskets of crumbs. Crumbs enough for all the nations that Israel had driven out of the Canaan land. Crumbs enough for all the nations driven out. You know what this is saying? This is saying that there is bread, the bread of the presence of Jesus, for every single person on the planet. Whether you're a Jew, there is bread enough for the Jews. Whether you're a Gentile, there is bread enough for the Gentiles. Jesus is making his presence available to all humanity. And this comes to the most incredible, glorious conclusion in the book of Revelation, right? In the book of Revelation, at the very end of the story, we come to Revelation chapter 21. And in Revelation 21, we have the most incredible story. There's a new heavens and there's a new earth. And in that new heaven and in that new earth, there is no temple in the city. For its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And there's a city. This is even more than an Eden. This is more than an Eden. The city has no need of the sun, because the city is there. This is incredible. This is more than an Eden. This is better than just a garden. This is a garden and a city. And the city has no need of the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light. And its lamp is the Lamb. And listen to this last line on this slide. By its light, the nations will walk. Wow. Jesus who provides bread for Gentiles, Jesus who provides bread for Jews, Jesus who provides bread for all the nations, makes a way for all the nations to come into his presence. And Revelation describes this incredible picture where there's a new heavens and a new earth, and there's a city, the New Jerusalem, and there's no need of the sun or there's no need of the moon because the glory of God is saturating that place. And by its light, by the light of the glory of God, the nations walk. And then it says, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. And the gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. They will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations. I love this verse. Wow, this is incredible. When God has made a new heaven and a new earth, there is something more than an Eden there. He has made a way for Jews and Gentiles, weak, broken sinners, all of us who are gathering crumbs at the feet of Jesus. He has made a way for us to come into his presence. He has thrown open wide the gates of the city. He has thrown open wide the access to the presence of God. And we come into this city, and this is the beautiful part. We, as kings of the earth, as members of the nations, we bring our glory, we bring our honor into that place. You know, every nation on earth, from the United States, I should say America, because it starts with an A, to Uzbekistan, because it starts with something further down the alphabet, right? Every nation, whether big or small, has things that make it beautiful. And Revelation says that we have something more than an Eden. We have a heavenly city where the nations will flow. Nations of Jews, nations of Gentiles, nations, every nation, every kindred, every tongue, every people. And we will bring our glory into that great city. And something more than an Eden will be restored. We will enjoy our original created purpose, and we will bring the beauty that God has given us here to there. My friends, God had a plan in the beginning that this earth would be a cosmic sanctuary where his presence dwells and where we would bask in it and reflect it out. And we someday, and someday soon, will have just what he made us for. We will dwell in the presence of God in that New Jerusalem where we bask in his presence and we bring the glory of the nations there. Let us pray together. Father, we love you. We thank you. We thank you for making a way back to Eden. Father, may you fill us with your presence. May we gather crumbs from the 12 baskets, crumbs from the 7 baskets, Lord. There's crumbs enough for every person in every nation. And God, may we bring that which is good about us and our nations into your kingdom. May you bless us in Jesus' name. Amen.